In a remote English village named Dunwich Hollow, cradled by the shadowed boughs of Sherwood Forest, a boy named Aedan grew up among whispers of ancient oaks and the rustle of deer. Life was woven from simple threads, dawn that broke over frost-covered thatch, chickens pecking the frozen dirt, and the rhythmic clink of the blacksmith's hammer echoing from the village forge. Yet in the modest hut where Aedan lived with his family, another kind of rhythm pulsed. The creak of bowstrings, the hiss of arrows, the crackle of pine as it was carved into weapons of war. Aedan's father, Rorik, was a Fletcher, one of the finest for miles, and his trade was passed on not just with instruction, but with quiet pride. He taught his son to carve shafts straight as the crow flies, to bind feathers with beeswax and sinew, and most of all, to respect the bow. The bow gives, but it takes, he often said. It can feed or it can kill. Know what you're drawing for. From the age of 6, Aedan's hands were blistered not by play, but by practice. He was slight but determined. By 10, he could shoot the eye out of a hare at 30 paces. Villagers watched with quiet admiration as the boy trained each day, loosing arrows into straw targets and moving birds alike. But no praise softened the burden that would soon fall on his shoulders. England was stirring with unrest. King Edward's eyes had turned toward France, and rumors drifted like fog through every village. The nobles spoke of feudal obligations, of duty and honor. The villagers whispered of war, conscription, and death. Then came the winter. Bitter and long, it howled through Dunwich Hollow with teeth of ice. It was during one such night, as snow piled against the cottage walls and the fire flickered low, that the messenger arrived. He rode in under a banner marked with the king's seal, his tabard soaked in sleet, his face drawn with exhaustion. By royal decree, he announced in the square, all able-bodied boys of 12 and older are to present themselves for muster at Nottingham within a fortnight. The king has called. Aedan watched from beneath his hood, his breath misting in the frigid air. He was 13. That night he could not sleep. His mother, Mare, wept quietly by the hearth. Rorik sat in silence, sharpening an old longbow, the same one he had carried at the Welsh border wars in his youth. Finally he stood and handed the bow to Aedan. "It's yours now," he said, voice like gravel. "It won't forgive weakness, neither will the world." There was no feast, no blessing, no ceremony. At first light, Aedan kissed his mother's hand, embraced his father without words, and stepped into the snow. On his back, the longbow. At his side, a bundle of arrows. In his chest, the steady hammer of a heart that would soon learn what it meant to truly endure. As he walked alone toward Nottingham, boots crunching against frost-bitten earth, Aedan looked once over his shoulder. The village seemed so small, so fragile beneath the blanket of winter. He turned away. His life as a boy was over. The life of an archer had begun. The road to Nottingham was not lined with glory, but with mud and frost. Aedan joined a growing number of boys and young men, all trudging the same path, drawn by the king's command and the quiet fear of what disobedience might bring. Some carried bows like him, others bore nothing but crude clubs or walking sticks. Few spoke. They were not comrades yet, only strangers linked by a shared fate. The castle at Nottingham loomed like a stone colossus, its towers black against the gray sky. Smoke curled from the chimneys and the air reeked of sweat, horses, and iron. Inside the castle yard, chaos reigned. Sergeants barked orders, smiths hammered iron-tipped arrowheads, and the clash of wooden practice swords rang out like war drums. Aedan was herded with the other recruits into a muddy training field behind the curtain wall. There he met Sergeant Halford, a man who looked more like a bear than a human. His face was a battlefield of scars, his voice like thunder over the moors. "You, boy with the big eyes, what's your name?" "Aedan, sir." "From where?" "Dunwich Hollow, sir." Halford snorted. "Hope they make 'em tough in the hollow. You'll need it." Training began at dawn and ended well after dark. The first lesson was pain. Bows twice the strength of Aedan's old one were thrust into their hands. Great war bows drawn with over 100 pounds of force. Drawing them once was a feat. Drawing them 50 times in a row was agony. Blisters burst. Backs ached. Arms trembled. But the beatings were worse. Discipline was absolute. Late to muster, 10 lashes. Speak out of turn, bread and water for 2 days. Fall asleep during training, dig a grave-sized hole and sleep in it. Yet Aedan endured. He remembered his father's words, his mother's tear-streaked face. Each time his muscles screamed, he gritted his teeth. Each time he thought he'd collapse, he imagined the cold woods of home and the pride in Rorik's eyes. As the days bled into weeks, the boys began to change. Some broke under pressure, sent home in disgrace or carted away with fever. But others, like Aedan, grew lean and hard. They learned to shoot not for sport, but for blood. Targets were replaced with straw mannequins shaped like armored men. They were taught to aim for weak points, the armpits, the eyes, the gaps behind the knee. They learned formation shooting, standing shoulder to shoulder in ranks of 10, loosing volleys with machine-like precision. Aedan discovered rhythm in the chaos, the music of bowstrings twanging in unison. He became fast and, more importantly, accurate. They trained with daggers, too, and short swords in case the enemy came too close. Aedan hated those lessons. The intimacy of steel against flesh frightened him more than arrows ever had. One night during a blizzard, a boy named Davy collapsed in the snow. He was 14, soft-faced and pale, with fingers too thin to draw the heavy bows. Aedan tried to rouse him, but the lad was already dead. Exposure, they said. Weakness. The body was dragged off without ceremony. Halford's voice was grim the next morning. "This is war, lads. Death doesn't wait for fair weather. If you can't outlast the wind, you won't outlast the French." They buried Davy outside the walls with a crude wooden cross. Aedan carved a small arrow into the wood with his knife. By the end of 3 months, Aedan was no longer a boy from Dunwich Hollow. He was a soldier in the making, his arms thick with new muscle, his gaze sharp and unreadable. The longbow, once his father's, now felt like a part of him. When the day of reckoning came, a roll call at dawn, names shouted and banners raised, he was among the chosen. His unit would be the first wave sent across the narrow sea to France. Aedan stood in line, the wind biting at his cloak, the world spinning toward war. He did not flinch. The journey across the narrow sea began in the chill of early spring, when the trees were still bare and the winds cut like sharpened blades. Aedan and his unit marched from Nottingham to the port town of Dover. 6 days of mud, blisters, and aching silence. Horses carried nobles and officers, but the archers walked. They always walked. The ship that waited for them at the harbor was a cog, flat-bottomed, broad-beamed, and crowded with men, weapons, crates of salted meat, barrels of water, and sacks of arrows. It reeked of sweat and old fish. As Aedan stepped onto the swaying deck, he felt his stomach twist. He had never seen the sea before. Now he would cross it to meet death. The voyage was brutal. The channel was rough and unforgiving. Men vomited over the sides, and the decks were slick with rain and bile. Aedan clung to the rail, watching the endless gray of sky and sea, wondering if he would die before ever loosing an arrow in battle. After 3 days, they landed on the northern coast of France, at a place called Calais, already taken and held by the English. There was no welcome, no food, no beds, only orders. Aedan's unit was marched inland at once, joining the king's advancing force. France was a land of shattered villages and burned fields. The archers moved like shadows, through rain and mud, past farms stripped of grain and orchards hacked to stumps. The English army practiced a terrible strategy, chevauché. They didn't just fight soldiers. They destroyed everything that fed and supported them. They burned wheat, slaughtered livestock, and torched entire hamlets. Aedan saw a child lying dead in a muddy lane, her doll crushed beneath a cartwheel. He stared too long. Sergeant Halford struck him on the back of the head. "Don't look, boy. Look and it follows you. Look and it kills you before any sword does." Each night they camped in the wet. They strung ropes between trees to hang their cloaks, lit smoky fires, and slept in shifts. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Their rations were thin and foul, hard biscuit and dried beef, sometimes moldy. Water was taken from streams or wells, often brackish and alive with insects. But even in the filth, the archers trained. They shot at straw dummies and at live pigs tied to stakes. Halford ordered them to kill swiftly and mercilessly. If it walks like a man but wears the wrong colors, you put it down. One morning, after weeks of rain and marching, they were given new orders. The French army had massed. Battle was coming. The archers were restless. Some whispered prayers, others carved symbols into their arrow shafts. Aedan did neither. He simply checked his gear. Bow waxed, strings dry, arrows counted and sorted. His father's bow felt heavier than ever. Then came the news that chilled every man to silence. They were to march to a field near a small village called Crécy. There they would meet the full might of the French. Aedan slept little the night before the battle. He lay awake, staring at the tattered canvas of the tent, listening to the wind, the murmurs of other boys, the click of prayer beads, and the quiet sobbing of someone too scared to hold it in. He did not cry. He did not pray. He only waited. Morning broke gray and grim. The English army took its position on a gentle slope, flanked by woods and hedgerows. The archers lined up in wedges, stakes driven into the earth before them to skewer any charging horse. Aedan knelt in the mud, bow across his lap, arrows driven into the ground at his side for quick drawing. Then the enemy appeared, an ocean of banners and glinting steel. Thousands of knights, their armor blazing in the sun, mounted on massive destriers. They thundered across the plain like a coming storm. Halford raised his hand. "Wait," he growled. "Hold." The knights closed the distance, their lances lowered. "Loose!" Aedan drew, aimed, and loosed. Again, again, again. Arrows filled the sky like a black swarm. They fell on the French like rain. Horses screamed. Men fell. Blood turned the field to mire. But the enemy kept coming. The Battle of Crécy had begun. And Aedan, no longer a boy, faced the true brutality of life as a medieval archer. The field was a killing ground. The Battle of Crécy raged from dawn until dusk, a symphony of screams, steel, and shattering thunder. Aedan loosed until his fingers bled. His arms trembled. The rhythm of battle overtook him. Draw, aim, release, draw, aim, release, until there was no thought, only survival. The French knights came in waves, banners flapping above their heads, lances gleaming. Their war horses charged uphill, straight into a wall of death. English arrows rained like iron hail, piercing armor, flesh, and bone. Horses crashed, threw their riders, and trampled the fallen. The air stank of sweat, blood, and fear. At Aedan's side, archers shouted in rhythm, keeping the volleys constant. Every few minutes, squires ran forward to retrieve bundles of arrows or drag back the wounded. Sergeant Halford bellowed above the chaos, his voice hoarse, face splattered with mud and blood. Aedan's knuckles were raw. He snapped one bowstring and had to re-string it in the mud while arrows whistled overhead. An enemy rider broke through the stakes and galloped straight at their line, sword raised high. Aedan dropped his bow, snatched a bodkin-pointed arrow, and drove it through the man's neck before the horse collapsed over the stakes. There was no time to think, no room for fear, only instinct and the endless thrum of violence. The French did not retreat. They charged again and again, noblemen screaming in rage and desperation. The English archers cut them down like wheat. Their longbows, 6 feet tall and made of yew, outmatched everything the French could muster. It was not chivalry, it was slaughter. By late afternoon, the sun dipped behind storm clouds and the field was slick with gore. The French ranks were broken. Their allies, the Genoese crossbowmen, had long since fled or died. The bodies of men and horses lay piled together like butchered livestock. Aedan stood over one such heap, arrows spent, limbs shaking. Blood soaked his sleeves. He had never killed a man before that day. Now he had killed dozens. Beside him, Halford laid a hand on his shoulder. "Still breathing?" Aedan nodded. "Good. That's more than most can say." The field fell silent as dusk approached. The cries of the dying faded into groans, then into stillness. Aedan walked among the corpses in a daze. He stepped over broken lances, severed limbs, and shattered helmets. He saw a boy no older than himself with his jaw split open, still clutching a crucifix in his hand. He dropped to his knees and retched. The night brought rain. Fires flickered across the field as the English collected wounded and stripped the dead. Looting was not just permitted, it was encouraged. Aedan couldn't bring himself to touch the bodies. He sat beneath a wagon, staring into the dark, his hands shaking. Halford approached him again, crouched beside him, and offered a flask. "Drink," he said. Aedan drank. The liquid burned his throat, but it warmed his gut. "You fought well," Halford muttered. "Remember what you did here. Never forget, but don't let it own you." "How?" Aedan asked. "You don't," Halford replied. "You just carry it, like your bow." That night, Aedan didn't sleep. He sat alone while the others snored or drank or sang songs to forget. The rain tapped gently on his shoulders, as if trying to cleanse the blood. The field outside Crécy would become legend, but for Aedan, it would always be the place where childhood died. The days after Crécy passed in a haze of ash and silence. Aedan walked like a ghost, his limbs sore, his soul heavier than his pack. The army did not linger. The dead were buried or burned, and the living were marched onward, deeper into enemy territory. The cheers of victory meant nothing to Aedan. He had survived, but something inside him had died. He felt it in the way food lost its taste, in the way laughter from the men grated against his ears. He cleaned his bow with methodical care, over and over, as if scrubbing blood from the wood might wash away what he'd done. At night he dreamed of arrows sinking into screaming faces. He awoke gasping, sweat pouring down his back. Halford said nothing, only handed him the flask, again and again. In the weeks that followed, Aedan noticed changes in himself. He flinched less. He watched more. He could tell a lie with ease, especially the lie that he was fine. They sacked a village near the Somme. Aedan was ordered to hold back two fleeing peasants, an old man and his daughter. When one of the mounted knights came to question them, the old man spat in his face. The knight didn't hesitate. He drove his sword through the man's chest. The girl screamed. Aedan turned his eyes away. "Lesson," Halford said afterward. "This isn't war, it's punishment." They moved from town to town, castle to castle, the English king pressing his claim. There was talk of another siege, talk of reinforcements from the south, talk of the French regrouping. But Aedan listened less to strategy and more to silence. One morning, Halford summoned him to the edge of camp. The sergeant looked different, tired, older, though he had always seemed carved from stone. "You'll take command of a dozen new boys," he said. "Archers, green as spring leaves." "Me?" Aedan blinked. "You've survived. That makes you qualified." And just like that, he became what Halford had once been, a teacher of death. The boys under his care were barely old enough to grow beards. They trembled when they notched arrows. Some vomited after shooting their first deer. Aedan taught them to string a bow in the rain, to keep their fingers from blistering, to look without staring when the killing started. He taught them not how to live, but how to last. In the evenings, he wrote letters home. Most were lies. He told his mother he was safe, that the war would be over soon, that he'd earned coin, that he still prayed. But there was one letter he couldn't write, one to his father. What could he say? That the bow had made him a killer? That he now understood the silence in his father's eyes? Sometimes he'd look at his reflection in puddles or polished metal and not recognize the face staring back. The war had carved him into something else, a shadow of who he had been. Still, he marched on. For an archer, there was no end until the war ended, or your strength gave out, and Aedan was not yet ready to fall. Autumn settled over northern France like a shroud. The English army, battered but emboldened by Crécy, turned toward Calais, one of the richest port cities on the French coast. The king wanted it taken, to strangle France's access to trade and secure a foothold across the Channel. But Calais was no village, it was a fortress. Aedan and his company arrived as the siege began. Calais sat behind high stone walls, protected by moats and marshland. It had food, weapons, and water. The English had numbers and patience. At first, the siege felt almost like a camp. Archers built wooden platforms and sheds. They dug trenches. They gathered firewood and repaired fletching. But soon the waiting turned bitter. Supplies dwindled. Food rotted. The cold crept in. Aedan's men thinned. Some died of fever, others from infected wounds that festered in the damp. Still others were executed for desertion. The French sent out taunting messages on arrows. Once they launched a barrel filled with dung and a crude drawing of the English king. "Let them mock," Halford growled. "They'll eat rats soon enough." And they did. Inside Calais, hunger took hold. Birds vanished. Dogs disappeared. Then came stories of boiled leather, of children made quiet by starvation. Still, the city held. The English tried everything, mining the walls, bombarding gates with mangonels, digging ditches to block any rescue. Archers stood ready day and night, watching, waiting. One night, Aedan spotted a figure trying to sneak through the reeds near the moat. He drew his bow and shouted. The man froze. Just a boy, no older than 15, carrying a bundle of herbs and a dead crow. The lad begged in broken English. "Food, for my mother, please." Aedan hesitated. Then Halford's voice rang out. "Loose." Aedan didn't move. Halford stepped up, took the shot himself. The boy fell. Silence followed. Later that night, Aedan stared at his bow. He didn't sleep. Winter came. Snow blanketed the siege lines. Fires burned constantly, but the cold gnawed at their bones. One morning, Aedan awoke to find one of his new archers stiff with frost. No one spoke his name. There were too many names already. Finally, in the deep of February, Calais broke. Starving and disease-ridden, the city surrendered. But King Edward demanded more than surrender. He wanted humiliation. He ordered the leading burghers of Calais, 6 of the city's wealthiest and most respected men, to walk out barefoot in plain robes with nooses around their necks, carrying the keys to the city. Aedan stood among the crowd as the burghers approached. Even hardened soldiers grew silent. These were not warriors. They were fathers, merchants, scholars. They knelt in the mud awaiting execution. It was only the queen, Philippa of Hainaut, who intervened. Pregnant, tearful, she begged her husband for mercy, and he granted it. The burghers lived, but the city did not. It was emptied of its French citizens, repopulated with English loyalists. Calais was English now, and would remain so for generations. Aedan walked its streets, past shuttered shops and silent homes, and wondered what had truly been won. Was it worth the frostbite, the famine, the deaths? He didn't know, but he still carried his bow. Spring brought no peace. The English army, swollen with ambition and spoils, spread deeper into the French countryside. Villages fell, fields burned. What crops remained were trampled under boots or stolen by foraging parties. The war left nothing untouched. Aedan led his band of archers through towns turned to rubble. Smoke rose from thatched roofs. Women wept. Old men cursed in trembling voices. Children watched with hollow eyes, knowing even the sky was not theirs anymore. They called it chevauchée, a campaign of devastation meant to cripple the enemy's resources and break the people's will. For Aedan, it felt like a slow rot, like cutting the roots of a tree and watching it die leaf by leaf. They raided a manor house on the edge of the Loire. Its noble family had fled, but servants remained. One of Aedan's men, a lad named Corwin, chased a girl into the stables. Aedan caught him before he did more than scare her. He dragged Corwin out by the collar and struck him. Hard. "We're not beasts," Aedan growled. Corwin spat blood. "We're soldiers." That night, Aedan drank alone under a shattered archway. He felt the weight of every command, every face he couldn't protect, every choice that turned him colder. Leadership was not glory. It was grief carried in silence. Word came of the French regrouping. Their new king, John II, raised fresh armies. The 100 Years' War, as it would one day be known, had only begun. But to those living it, it wasn't a timeline. It was every breath, every burial, every broken home. The archers were ordered south toward the Garonne. Rumors swirled of reinforcements from Gascony, of a confrontation brewing near Poitiers. Halford was silent, his eyes sunken. The old sergeant coughed more often now, blood flecking his handkerchief. One morning, Aedan found Halford sitting by a stream, staring into the water. "You should have left after Crécy," Halford said. "A wise man knows when he's done enough." "I'm not wise," Aedan replied. "No," Halford smiled sadly. "You're a soldier." Halford died 2 weeks later, fever taking him as surely as a sword. Aedan buried him beneath an oak tree, his bow laid across his chest. No priest, no hymns, just a moment of silence and the soft thrum of wind in the leaves. The army moved on, always onward. The world Aedan once knew, his village, his parents, the boy with a carved wooden bow, felt like a dream faded with morning light. He was something else now. He had become the storm that others feared, a shadow on the horizon, a name in someone else's nightmare. He no longer questioned why he fought. That answer had been lost somewhere between Crécy and Calais, between frostbite and fire. But deep inside, beneath the armor and ash, a flicker of the boy remained, and it watched him with sad, silent eyes. The sun beat down on the fields near Poitiers, but there was no warmth in it, only heat and dust and dread. Aedan stood among his archers, scanning the horizon. The English were outnumbered, badly. King Edward's son, the Black Prince, commanded their force, but the French had over twice their number, fresh horses and the high ground. The field would become legend, but none of them knew that yet. They only knew fear. Aedan's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the bracer on his arm. He checked each of his men, some veterans, many barely more than boys. He saw himself in their wide eyes. He wanted to speak, to give courage. But what words could matter now? The French advanced with banners snapping, armor gleaming. Their knights looked like gods of war. But Aedan had seen gods bleed before. The signal came. Drums thudded, horns blared, arrows loosed. The sky darkened as thousands of shafts arced into the heavens. Aedan's breath caught as they fell like iron rain. He watched through narrowed eyes as horses reared and men screamed, impaled or crushed under their own mounts. Again and again. Arrows flying until arms ached and fingers split. The French broke through the hedges. Battle turned to chaos. Archers drew daggers, axes, swords stripped from the dead. Aedan fought hand to hand, blood in his eyes, screams in his ears. The world narrowed to blades and breath and survival. At one point, he locked eyes with a French knight, young, noble, terrified. Aedan stabbed him in the thigh. The knight fell, groaning. Aedan moved on. He could not count how many fell, could not name how many he killed. When the dust settled, the field was carpeted in bodies. Thousands dead, French nobility captured, their king, John II, taken in chains. It was a rout, an English victory sung for generations. But to Aedan, it was a graveyard. He wandered the aftermath, stepping over corpses, calling for his men. Some answered, many did not. He found a boy from his unit, Oren, clutching a bloodied bow, staring blankly at the sky. Aedan knelt beside him. "You did well," he said softly. Oren did not respond. Aedan closed his eyes and moved on. The victory meant more land, more ransom, more power for England. But it cost more than Aedan had left to give. He felt hollow, like a bow drawn too far, strings frayed, limbs ready to crack. That night by the fire, surrounded by fewer friends than before, he thought of his father, of the field back home where he first loosed an arrow, of a life unclaimed. He stared into the flames and whispered, "I'm tired." No one answered. Only the fire spoke, crackling softly, as if mourning with him. Months passed. Peace was a rumor, whispered by envoys and inked by nobles who never touched a blade. But for Aedan, peace meant something simpler, the chance to go home. The Black Prince had returned to England in triumph, his prisoners in chains. Aedan, bloodied and tired, chose a quieter path. He joined a caravan of wounded and discharged men heading west. The roads were rough, bandits and hunger stalked them, but Aedan had survived worse. When he finally saw the hills of his homeland rising in the distance, a strange ache filled his chest. He had imagined this return so many times, yet now each step felt heavier. His village was smaller than he remembered. The field seemed narrower, the thatched roof slumped lower. He stood by the well where he once practiced with a wooden bow. It had changed little. The stone was worn, moss-covered. A woman walked past him and paused. She squinted at his face. "Aedan." It was Marta, his childhood friend, older now. A widow, she said. The plague had come, taken her husband and two of her children. Only her youngest survived. Aedan had no words. She offered him shelter. He stayed in her barn, helped tend the goats, mended fences. The bow hung in the rafters, untouched. At night, he dreamed of war, of faces he couldn't save, of Halford's rasping cough, of boys dying in mud. One morning, he took the bow and walked into the forest. He found the old stump he had once used for target practice. The wind rustled the leaves. He notched an arrow. Drew. Released. The arrow hit the mark. Another. Another. He fired until the quiver emptied, until his arm trembled with effort. Then he sat, alone among the trees, and wept. He wept for those who never came home, for those who did and could never speak of it, for the boy he used to be. And when the tears stopped, he breathed. The forest was quiet, peaceful, alive. And for the first time in years, so was he. Years passed. Aedan never returned to war. He lived quietly, helping Marta raise her son, Tom. The child asked once about the bow in the rafters. Aedan smiled, took it down, and showed him how to string it, how to stand, how to breathe. Tom grew. The world changed. Kings died. New wars brewed. But Aedan remained in the village, growing older, growing quieter. He wrote sometimes with shaking hands and an ink-stained sleeve. Not poetry, not history, just memories. The names of the fallen, the places he'd seen, the pain he carried. He left the pages in a small chest beneath his bed. One winter, when his joints ached and the wind cut like steel, Aedan fell ill. Marta cared for him, and Tom, now a young man, sat by his side. Was it worth it? Tom asked one evening. Aedan thought a long time before answering. It was never about worth, he said. It was about doing what was needed, surviving, protecting, and remembering. He died not long after, peacefully. No drums, no banners, just the soft hush of snow falling outside. At his burial, Tom carried the old longbow. He planted it upright in the earth beside the grave, a silent monument. And though time wore away the markings on the stone, villagers still told tales of the archer who returned, the man who carried war in his bones but chose peace in his final days. The boy with the bow had become legend, and legends, once loosed into the world, never truly fade.